Hello and welcome to the 11 Plus series here at MP Maths. What we're going to do today then is to go through the topic of fractions. And the way we're going to do this is essentially to cover firstly the basics, so what are fractions, what does equivalent fractions, or what are equivalent fractions, what are top-heavy fractions. We're going to look at mixed numbers. And then what we're going to do is to look at some calculations. So how do we add fractions? How do we subtract fractions? How do we multiply fractions? How do we divide fractions? And finally, we're going to end with a couple of exam questions from a past paper. So this is from an actual 2016 past paper from Sevenoaks, the school Sevenoaks. So we're going to finish with that. Right, so if we start with some definitions. So this is what you need to know for your 11 plus exam to be able to comfortably answer fraction and fraction related questions. So what is a fraction then? So a fraction is part of a whole. So what do we mean then by that? Well, for example, 1 over 2 or a half. So that is not a whole number. It's part of a whole number. So it's a half. That would be what we call a fraction. So other fractions would be, say, a quarter, 3/4, 2/3, 5/6. All of these are they're not whole numbers. So when we mean whole numbers, we mean actual numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. They're all whole numbers. They are not fractions. So that's what a fraction is, or how we represent a fraction. We then have something called equivalent fractions. So what are equivalent fractions? Well, equivalent fractions are, as the name suggests, the same fractions. So these are fractions that look different, but they show the same amount. So for example, if we take 1/2 and we take 2 over 4, well, 1/2 is exactly the same thing as 2 over 4. Well, why is that? If we look at what the difference is, essentially 2 over 4 is just 1 over 2 times 2. So if I times the top of the fraction 1 by 2, so that's times 2, and the 2 by 2, that's times 2 to give me 4, the 2 over 4 is just double 1 over 2. So we could carry on and say that this is also the same thing as 4 over 8. Because 2 over 4, so 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 2 is 8, or 1 times 4 is 4, and 2 times 4 is 8, so a half is the same thing as 4 over 8, which is the same thing as 2 over 4. These are all what we call equivalent fractions. In this case, the half is what we would term that as the simplified fraction, or the most simple fraction. We can't reduce the half, we can't divide the top and bottom by 2. It's a simple fraction. Whereas 2 over 4 or 4 over 8, we can divide. There are numbers that go into both 4 and 8, or 2 and 4, and that is 1 and 2, 1/2. Okay, so if we look at the next definition or next concept, so improper fractions. So what are improper fractions? Another term for improper fractions you might have heard is also top-heavy fractions. So what are these improper or top-heavy fractions? Well, again, as the name suggests, when we say top-heavy, this is where we have a fraction such as, so e.g., if we had 7 over 3. We call this top-heavy because the numerator, so remember, numerator means the top of the fraction. So the 7 here is greater than the denominator, or another word for the denominator is the bottom of the fraction. So here, 7 is greater than 3. And so we call that top-heavy or improper. So a couple of other examples, so e.g., 6 over 5, or 11 over 3, or 7 over 4. These are all what we call top-heavy or improper fractions. Okay, so one of the things that you need to know for this exam is how to go from a top-heavy or a mixed number. So how to go from a mixed number to a top-heavy fraction, or from a top-heavy fraction to a mixed number. So before we do that, let's have a look at what mixed numbers are. So mixed numbers are essentially a combination. So mixed numbers contain a whole number and a fraction. So if we take a couple of examples, so mixed numbers would be, so e.g., let's say 2.5. So here we have the whole number, which is 2, and we have a fraction, which is a half. Or, for example, 3.25. Again, we have a whole number, 3, and we have a fraction, a quarter. So we call this mixed numbers because it contains a combination of a whole number and a fraction. Right, so we need to know how to go from a mixed number to a top-heavy fraction. And there's a rule. The way we do this, essentially, is you take the whole number, so in this case, your whole number is 3. You multiply by the bottom of the fraction. So in this case, the bottom of the fraction is a quarter. The bottom, or the denominator, is 4. So 3 times 4 is 12. And then you add the top of the fraction. So in this case, the top of the quarter, or the numerator, is 1. So 12 plus 1 equals 13. And your fraction, your top-heavy fraction, becomes 13 over the original denominator. So in this case, the denominator of the bottom of the fraction is 4. So 13 over 4. So if we look at 2.5, then we would do 2 times the bottom of the fraction, or the denominator, which is 2. So 2 times 2 is 4, plus the numerator of the fraction, or the top of the fraction. So 4 plus 1 is 5. So we'll have 5 over the original denominator of that fraction, which is just a 2. So 5 over 2 and 2.5 are the same thing. 13 over 4 and 3.25 are also the same thing. Now let's see if we can go the other way around. So how do we go from a top-heavy fraction to a mixed number? So if we look at 5 over 2, now this is quite straightforward. You take the bottom of the fraction, or the denominator, which is 2, and you see how many 2's go into 5. Well, we know that 2 times 2 is 4, so you're going to have a whole number of 2. And what's the remainder? Well, 5 minus 4 is 1. So 1 over, and then the bottom of the fraction remains how it is. So in 5 over 2, the bottom is 2, so we've got 2.5. And if we look at 13 over 4 then, how do we go from here to the mixed number? Well, same sort of thing. So how many 4's go into 13? 4 times 3 is 12, and remainder 1. So 13 minus 12 is 1, so remainder 1, and then the bottom of the fraction is the same as what we have here. So it's going to be 3.25. Right, so that's a quick guide or recap to the basic concept of fractions in terms of the definitions, and how to go from top-heavy fractions to mixed numbers, and mixed numbers to top-heavy fractions. So let's have a look at then some questions, or some of the types of calculations that you might be asked in the exam. So if I just rub this page out quickly. Right, so e.g. then, we'll start with addition. So how do we add fractions? So let's take, for example, 1/2 plus 1/4. Well, how do we add this fraction? Right, so the rule is this. You can only add fractions when the denominator is the same. So remember, denominator means the bottom number, numerator means the top number. So when the denominator is the same. Now, how do we make, or another way of saying that is, when we have a common denominator. In this case, we've got a denominator of 2 and a denominator of 4. Now, what can I do here? Well, I can change that 1 over 2 in that I can multiply both the bottom and the top by 2. So if I make the bottom into 4, then how do I get to 4? Well, 2 times 2 is 4. If I do that to the bottom, I've got to do it to the top. So the 1 will become a 2. So we've got 2 over 4 now, plus 1 over 4. Another way of saying that is the 2 over 4 and the 1 over 2. So this 1 over 2 here and the 2 over 4 are equivalent fractions. Just like we looked at earlier, these are what we would call equivalent fractions. Now we can add these fractions quite straightforward. And the way we do that is, once we have a common denominator in our answer, that denominator will stay the same. So it will still be 4. But the numerator, we can go ahead and add. So the 2 plus the 1 now equals to 3. So we add the numerator and we leave the denominator as it is. Let's take another example then. Let's say we had 2/3 plus 3/4. Right, so same sort of thing now. We need a common denominator. So what do 3, obviously 3 and 4 are not the same number, but what do 3 and 4 both go into? Well, the smallest number that they both go into is 12. So if I make the bottom here 12, and I make the bottom here 12, in the 2/3 fraction, how do I get from 3 to 12? I times by 4. So I now have to do the same thing from the top. So 2 times 4 is 8. In the 3/4 fraction, how do I get from 4 to 12? I times by 3. So I need to do the same thing to the top. So 3 times 3 is 9. Now in my answer, I'm going to have the same denominator, so the common denominator, which is 12. And the top of the fraction, well, now I just add the two numerators. So the 8 over 12 plus 9 over 12. So the 8 plus the 9 is 17 over 12. And that is my answer. And you notice that here we have a top-heavy fraction, which if we needed to or wanted to, we can convert that into a mixed number. So we look at how many 12s go into 17. The answer is 1. What's the remainder? Well, 17 minus 12 is 5. So you'll have 1 and 5 over the original denominator, which is 12. So 1 and 5 over 12. So that is your addition of fractions. If we look now at subtraction, and we'll do one example here. The reason why is that subtraction is essentially the process is exactly the same as addition, except in the final step, instead of adding the numerators, you're going to take away the numerators. So let's take an example. If we had 2/3, let's say 2/5 minus 1/3. Now, here, again, in the denominator, we've got a 5 and a 3. We need a common denominator. So what do 5 and 3 both go into? The smallest number that they both go into is 15. So, how do I get from 5 to 15? I times by 3. So I've got to do the same thing to the top. 3 times 2 is 6. How do I get from the 3 to the 15? I times by 5. So do the same thing to the top. So 1 times 5 is 5. Now in your answer, the common denominator is 15. And in the numerator, you're just going to do the subtraction. So 6 minus 5 is 1. So your answer is 1 over 15. Right. Third calculation then, multiplication. Now this is really easy. So how do we do multiplication of fractions? Well, the answer is you just multiply. Now what we mean by that is you multiply not only the top of the fraction, but here you also multiply the bottom. So there's no common denominator, there's no workings around trying to find the common denominator. So again, we'll do one example. So e.g., let's say we had 2/3 times 3/5. We would simply multiply the top by each other to give us, so 3 times 2 is 6, and we would also multiply the bottom. So 3 times 5 is 15. Now, here we can actually simplify the fraction because 6 and 15, well, what goes into both 6 and 15? 3 does. 3 goes into it. How many 3s go into 6? 2. How many 3s go into 15? 5. So we can leave our answer as 2/5 because 2/5 and 6/15 are what we call, just like earlier, we looked at equivalent fractions. Right, okay, let's look at the final one, which is division then. So this is slightly more complicated, but again, it's just a rule. If you know the rule, it's very easy to apply. We'll do this by a question again. So let's say we had e.g. 2/3 divided by 1 over 4. Right. Now,